Once again, for those of you who have just...
The Challenger riding as it's supposed to. Then that small explosion on the right side of one of the solid rocket boosters, followed by the greater and main explosion. All of this happening a minute and 12 seconds into this morning's launch. The 56 times NASA has put a man, at least one human, into space. Now, on the upper right-hand side, pardon me for interrupting, but you can now see this is terrifying and fascinating. You see the slow motion. Look at your picture, upper right-hand quadrant of the picture. You can see the long pencil-like extension away from the explosion, upper right-hand corner of your screen. That is one of the solid rocket boosters blown apart from the space shuttle, as the space shuttle, its main fuel tank, and the shuttle itself and the other solid rocket booster are completely obliterated. And you could see, emphasize again, that in the slow motion, that the first explosion occurred on the right-hand side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And as Bruce Hall said earlier, there was a hard freeze in Florida this morning, and one of the theories, underscore, italicize, all caps, one of the theories...
Flight 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Roger, go with throttle up. The last words heard from Space Shuttle Challenger. The fireball, the smoke, the debris plunging toward the ocean just east of the Cape Canaveral launch site. Now, for the critical moments of today's disaster, here is slow motion videotape just before the explosion. You can see the first explosion. Hard to tell whether it happens on the main liquid tank or in the solid rocket fuel boosters. Then the devastating wipeout explosion. And carry it a little bit forward because you can see one of the, in the upper right-hand part of your screen, we think you can see one of the solid rocket fuel boosters just sticking out and being blown away. There it is in the upper right-hand quadrant of your screen. One of the 2 solid rocket fuel boosters at this stage still at least partially intact, being blown away from that fireball. That a slow motion replay of
Ground range.
Those are the big solid fuel booster rockets, the white ones we've so accustomed to seeing on the outside. At some point, they are destined, of course, to break away as they drive the Space Shuttle Challenger closer to its orbit. That great big cigar-like thing you see underneath Challenger is an enormous tank of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, the main tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Just under 2,000 miles an hour.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Go with throttle up. Take the extra boost. go for orbit.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And there you see it, about 2 minutes and 10 seconds after the flight began at Cape Canaveral this morning. That which you see flaming off into the distance is one of the external tanks, the solid fuel rockets going off on its own. Those great, enormous tanks which give the shuttle its initial early boost are designed to be recoverable. They are made of heavy steel and drop into the Atlantic Ocean for recovery and reuse.
Here looking very carefully at the situation.
This is a videotape you're watching.
Malfunction. We have no downlink.
No downlink, no communications, in other words, between Mission Control and the shuttle. 11:39 this morning Eastern Time in those jet blue skies over the Atlantic as debris falls towards the Atlantic some 10 to 18 miles from Cape Canaveral itself, because it wasn't, of course, going straight up, but downrange as well. And rescue crews and contingency rescue teams, as they call them, have now gone out into the Atlantic. Had to wait for almost an hour.
From the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
A certain note of what do we do next from Mission Control in Houston this morning. I was saying that it took over an hour before the contingency recovery.
NASA officials late tonight say they may be zeroing in on the likely cause of Tuesday's shuttle explosion.
Studying film of the flight, they observed what appears to be an unexpected change in the range tracking image, seen as an unusual plume in the lower part of the right SRB area of the system.
New NASA videotape released tonight supports the so-called blowtorch theory. There are reports that the right rocket booster experienced a drop in power moments before the accident. Investigators reportedly believe the power loss may have been caused by flames burning through the booster and then through the giant fuel tank, triggering the explosion. Videotape of the suspect's solid rocket booster after the blast shows an unusual exhaust flow. Experts say it may indicate a hole in the booster rocket. NASA officials say they are looking into all possible theories, but tonight officials say they will release new videotape and still photographs of the explosion and release a statement on the focus of their investigation. Last night, searchers unloaded a solid rocket booster nose cone. Officials then learned it still contained several small explosive charges, which were then deactivated.
Some kind of a release valve.
Today, pieces of Challenger were picked up by fishermen and by Navy and Coast Guard searchers. This piece appears to be from the top of the orbiter. Beneath the surface, a mini robot submarine like this one examined a large piece of debris that some have speculated is the remains of Challenger's crew compartment. Each day, officials say the pieces they find on the surface are getting smaller.
Let's go on. Let's find the reason for this tragedy and continue the struggle for fulfilling man's highest dreams.
More than 3,000 NASA employees, many part of the launch team, this morning gathered to mourn the 7 dead astronauts. A wreath was dropped into the sea at 11:39, the same time Challenger exploded on Tuesday. Moments later, a school of dolphin rose nearby. It was a difficult morning for those who had been through an agonizing week.
God bless us all.
Peter Van Sant, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Well, now,
nearing an end.
NASA sources say investigators are almost certain the space shuttle disaster was caused by a burst of fire from the right booster rocket. It is believed that a plume of flame ignited Challenger's fuel tank, and the sources say NASA officials are already talking about scheduling another shuttle mission for June. Al Sunshine has more.
The Interim Review Board is reportedly so confident that a failure in the shuttle's solid rocket booster set off Challenger's fiery end that NASA officials are, for the first time, talking about resuming America's shuttle program. The plume of 6,000-degree flame seen coming off the right side booster comes from an area where solid rocket components are joined together. NASA photographs diagram the so-called booster field joint that is put together inside the shuttle's vehicle assembly building. While NASA refuses to speculate on what caused the failure, spokesmen are saying they believe the design of the shuttle system is sound, having flown 24 earlier successful flights. The investigation is apparently looking at a possible manufacturing or assembly defect of Challenger's booster rocket.
I'm optimistic from what I've heard the administrator say, and also from my past evaluation of many problems in missiles, that we are going to find a component type problem or a manufacturing type problem, and not going to find a basic design problem.
While pieces of Challenger's wreckage continue to arrive back to Cape Canaveral, NASA officials are now discussing the possibility of getting the shuttle program back into the air.
If there is not a basic design flaw, it's a component or a manufacturing defect or even a human operator error, we would stand a very good chance of having a flight by the summertime or later.
While NASA's review board may be closing in on a solid rocket booster failure as the cause of Challenger's explosion, NASA spokesmen say they expect it will still take full congressional hearings to give the shuttle program a green light and get it back off the ground. Al Sunshine, Headline News at the Kennedy Space Center.
The nose cone from one of the solid rocket boosters has been found in the Atlantic Ocean. The 5-ton cone was taken to an Air Force base near Cape Canaveral for study. It was originally thought to be part of the shuttle's external fuel tank. The cone was discovered 100 miles off the coast of Savannah, Georgia. In New York and around the nation, church services were held in memory of Challenger's 7 fallen crew members. Prayers were spoken and tears shed in Houston as well, home to many of the astronauts. Frank Seltzer has more on services in Houston.
If there is a memorial for the Challenger crew, a place where people can come to express their grief, the Johnson Space Center in Houston is that place. Flowers continue to arrive, and so do the people. And in churches nearby, the memorial services go on. Be strong in the Lord and be of good courage, your defender is he. This one at the Baptist Church where the Scobie family was a member. Here, astronauts, both former and current, spoke to the congregation, trying to give comfort to the neighbors, friends, and families of the Challenger 7.
This week has been a week of sorrow, but it's been also a week of healing and togetherness. A little bit of all of us was on the Challenger. It was the inborn sense of adventure that knows no political boundaries or personal grievances the world over.
The Apollo 1 crew had given their lives for our success, and really we were flying in their place. They are flying free. May God bless them and bless their family.
The mourning is almost over and the healing underway. And Monday, the people of NASA know it will be time to make sure the price paid by Challenger won't come due again. Frank Seltzer, Headline News.
Despite the tragedy of Challenger, the nation's children are still expressing enthusiasm over spaceflight. The New York Times CBS News poll reveals that 2/3 of the children interviewed still would like to travel in space. Less than half their parents expressed the same view. But the vast majority of parents also said the space program should continue. A Pennsylvania man is receiving a...
Good evening. This is the CBS Sunday Night News. I'm Charles Osgood. NASA investigators believe they may know now what caused the Challenger shuttle to explode on Tuesday, killing the 7 crew members. Newly released pictures show something the astronauts had no way of knowing. Peter Van Sant reports.
Challenger's 7-member crew never realized their ship was in disastrous shape. Sensors didn't tell them that flame had burst through the side of the right solid rocket booster and was striking the giant fuel tank.
The plume appeared right in this area, just above the point where the solid rocket attaches to the expendable tank.
About 15 seconds after the flame first appeared, Challenger exploded. Spaceflight experts say the crew may have been warned in time to attempt an escape if NASA engineers hadn't removed a number of solid rocket sensors to reduce weight.
I think that would have shown up very clearly on the telemetry, and apparently of the order of 10 seconds before the final failure.
The solid rockets have been involved in a series of mishaps. In 1983, one solid rocket on the Shuttle Challenger came within 0.2 of an inch of burning through its exhaust nozzle, a potentially fatal event.
There's really no malfunction you can train for. If you lose one and the other's still going, it's just curtains.
In November 1983, another faulty nozzle caused a 1-month flight delay. NASA officials believe any problem with the solid rockets can be solved.
There's a problem there, but the overall configuration and design we believe to be fundamentally sound, and we don't think it'll take a very long time to get this problem corrected.
NASA officials reportedly have set June 20th as the target date for the next shuttle launch. Peter Van Sant, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
The Challenger crew and their families were remembered at Sunday church services across the nation. There were some special memorial services as well, including those at Huntsville, Alabama, where the booster rockets are made. Sandy Gilmore reports.
More than 2,000 people from the Marshall Space Center, the designers and overseers of the shuttle's rocket systems, attended today's memorial. Alabama's Governor George Wallace told them there cannot be dreams without nightmares.
We cannot succeed without occasional failure.
Members of NASA's Interim Mishap Investigation Board attended the memorial, including William Lucas, director of the nearby Marshall Space Center.
For us, that challenge is to demonstrate that man can successfully explore and live and work in space.
The investigating team briefly dropped in at the Huntsville Operations Support Center, where NASA monitors computerized data from the shuttle's engines, rockets, and fuel tank. The investigators believe the data collected here could help prove the cause of the shuttle explosion.
When the investigative team says they're complete and they've made the changes they need to make, if any, I'm ready to go.
Late today, investigators flew back to Kennedy Space Center. They may issue a preliminary report as soon as next Tuesday. Sandy Gilmore, CBS News, Huntsville, Alabama.
A plume of flame coming from the right-hand booster rocket. However, NASA is not easing up on its search for debris, nor its search for other possible causes of the disaster that killed 7 American astronauts. A top Pentagon official...
News, I'm Jane Akery. NASA hopes a trip to the ocean floor will get to the bottom of the Challenger disaster. Today's search will focus on the shuttle's booster rockets. Sources say that assembly problems with those boosters may be to blame for last week's deadly explosion. More from Brian Nelson.
For a week now, ships, planes, and helicopters from the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the Marines have combed a total of 60,000 square miles of Atlantic. 11 tons of floating pieces of Challenger have been recovered and returned to become part of the investigation into the shuttle's disaster. However, after 2 consecutive days of meager findings, the Coast Guard announced that the surface search will be scaled down.
We're not finding anything. Material recovered yesterday was pretty minimal, and almost nothing's been recovered today.
The recovery effort will depend less on ships and helicopters and more on fixed-wing aircraft that can more easily spot the widely dispersed pieces of shuttle wreckage. The main thrust of the search will now shift underwater, where several large objects have been detected by sonar, but where the early results have not been encouraging.
It's very slow, as you know, but we have identified about 17 targets that we'd like to look at, and we have eliminated a couple of the main targets that we've had previously. We found a helicopter and a light aircraft, and so we've been able to eliminate those.
There had been some hope of locating the shuttle's heavily reinforced crew cabin on the ocean floor, but that is now in doubt. The search effort has also failed to locate the lower half of Challenger's right-hand solid rocket booster, the one whose unusual plume of flame now makes it the leading suspect for having caused the shuttle's explosion. Brian Nelson, Headline News at the Kennedy Space Center.
President Reagan is superseding NASA's review board on the Shuttle Challenger tragedy. He announced yesterday a 12-member commission to conduct an impartial investigation into the accident. Former Secretary of State William Rogers will chair the Blue Ribbon panel. The first man to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong, has been named vice chairman. Also on the commission, Sally Ride, America's first woman astronaut who flew on Challenger's second mission. And test pilot Chuck Yeager, the first person to break the sound barrier. The panel has 120 days to determine a probable cause and recommend corrective action.
It's vital that the American people have confidence in the credibility of the Commission. I don't anticipate, once we get started, that there'll be a question about our impartiality or our willingness to follow any path, no matter where it leads.
They are America's destiny, and they will turn tragedy into triumph once again. Those words from former astronaut Senator John Glenn. He was one of hundreds at a memorial service for astronaut Judith Resnick yesterday in Akron, Ohio. In Concord, New Hampshire, family and friends of the late Krista McAuliffe held their own private memorial. Governor John Sununu was among the invited mourners. At noon in El Segundo, California, thousands of Hughes Aircraft colleagues of Greg Jarvis held a simple service. Monday was also a day to remember Ronald McNair, the second black in space and the first man in the hearts of some Houston friends. Frank Seltzer reports.
It was time for Ron McNair's friends in Houston.
That NASA officials had been warned last summer in internal memos that flight safety was being compromised by potential failure of the seals. Said one memo, failure during launch would certainly be catastrophic. A commission spokesman, Mark Weinberg, said a public hearing on the seal question will be held on Tuesday. Coming up later in this broadcast.
Documents discuss the potential for failure of the seals on the shuttle's booster rockets. As Robert Shackney reports, the commission investigating the shuttle disaster wants to see those documents.
6 months before the launch of Space Shuttle Challenger, mid-level space agency analysts were writing memos warning that seals on the shuttle's solid rocket boosters could rupture with catastrophic results. According to the memos obtained by the New York Times, seals on rockets recovered from previous shuttle flights showed burn damage on 12 occasions. Flight safety has been and is being compromised by potential failure of the seals, said one memo dated last July, and failure during launch would certainly be catastrophic. According to spaceflight experts, the evidence suggests that, in fact, is what happened to Challenger.
Clearly, the joints are the weakest link in the entire system because those simply have these plastic pressure seals rather than solid steel.
And if they should fail?
If these seals fail, you could have an accident such as we just had.
This is the problem area that worried the NASA engineers, the seams between the rocket's 4 main sections. When the sections are locked together before flight, they're supposed to be sealed completely by what are called O-rings, something like giant washers, 2 for each seam. Last week, NASA publicly admitted that these seals have been troublesome.
We have seen some evidence of what we call blow by those seals, some erosion of those seals.
Was that any cause for concern?
Oh, yes. I mean, yeah, that's an anomaly, and that was thoroughly worked, and that's completely documented.
What the space agency hasn't said so far is what it did, if anything, about the problem, and that is raising troublesome questions.
With a problem like this, I don't think they should have been flying the shuttle until they'd fixed it.
The NASA memo suggests the space agency was worried about the cost of fixing the problem with the seals, calling it a budget threat. The Special Presidential Commission examining the space shuttle disaster wants these questions about the memos answered quickly. Its chairman asked for all the documents today. The full commission will examine them in a closed session tomorrow and hold a public hearing on Tuesday. Robert Shackney, CBS News, Washington.
In Alberta, Canada,
To happen. Robert Shackney reports.
Looking for quick answers, the Presidential Investigating Commission has called space agency officials to a closed session tomorrow and a public hearing Tuesday to explain the agency memos written last July that warn of possible catastrophic problems with the shuttle's solid rockets. The problem areas are seams between the rocket's 4 main sections, which are supposed to be sealed tightly before flight by large donut-shaped rubber devices known as O-rings, devices that may have failed.
Now, if you sprang a leak in one of those seams, the exhaust gases would escape from the rocket and they would progressively burn through the skin of the rocket. If these seals fail, you could have an accident such as we just had.
The memos obtained by the New York Times say rockets recovered from earlier shuttle flights show the seals badly burned on at least 12 occasions. One memo written last July warns flight safety has been and is being compromised by potential failure of the seals, and failure during launch would certainly be catastrophic.
NASA officials haven't said publicly what, if anything, they did about these warnings. They say they're now gathering all the pertinent documents. We'll tell all to the Presidential Commission tomorrow and the next day. Robert Shackney, CBS News, Washington.
Answered a question which has been on a lot of people's minds since the disaster on board Challenger. NASA is going ahead with its Citizen in Space program, and it has named a teacher to make the next flight. Here's ABC's Lynn Sher.
At a hastily called news conference, acting NASA Administrator William Graham said teacher Barbara Morgan will be the first private citizen to fly in space, and she has accepted. The 34-year-old elementary school teacher from McCall, Idaho, trained at Krista McCullough's side last year, and she'll go on NASA's payroll until August to keep the Teacher in Space program alive. She was not at the press conference today, but yesterday on her way home, she indicated her feelings.
My answer is I'd like to fly just like everybody else fly too.
Some of the other finalists in the program said today they had no qualms about flying themselves.
When they deem that it is flight ready, I would be confident that, to their knowledge, it is ready to go, and I would be willing to go.
But the timing of the announcement seemed designed to divert public attention from the focus on NASA's safety procedures, particularly recent revelations from internal agency documents that they'd waived requirements for backup seals between the solid rocket booster segments, even though they knew failure of the seals could lead to the kind of explosion that destroyed Challenger and its crew of 7. NASA continues to insist the seals tested safely before the shuttle launch, but the Presidential Commission investigating the accident arrived here in Florida this morning to look into that. Today they asked about NASA's review process before launch with special attention to the main engines, rocket boosters, and weather conditions at the time of the launch. They also reviewed NASA photos, including some just released from an engineering camera showing an unusual puff of smoke from the right booster just after launch. NASA provided no explanation, but the photos seem to indicate that whatever triggered the fatal blast, it began as Challenger left the Earth. Tomorrow, the Presidential Commission continues its on-site investigation with tours of the launch pad, the building where the solid rocket booster segments are put together, and the hangar where the debris from Challenger is being collected. So far, says Chairman William Rogers, their visit here has been of benefit to the Commission. Lynn Sher, ABC News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
Later in the believes that it may have found what it's been looking for underwater, parts of the Shuttle Challenger's right booster rocket. Much of the evidence so far points to that booster as being the likely cause of the Challenger explosion. Bill Whitaker has more.
Searchers in a small, deep-diving submarine located and photographed what they believe to be pieces of Challenger's right solid rocket booster. They found the debris on the ocean floor, some 40 miles off Cape Canaveral. Tomorrow, NASA plans to compare the underwater photos with pre-launch pictures of the booster for a positive ID. Investigators have zeroed in on the right solid rocket booster as the prime suspect in the shuttle explosion. Meanwhile, NASA has agreed to remove officials who made the decision to launch Challenger from the agency's internal investigation team. The chairman of the Presidential Commission requested the move yesterday after a 2-day visit to the Kennedy Space Center and what he called frank and detailed discussions with NASA officials.
In-depth, not casual questions, but in-depth questions of many of the people involved.
A source close to the investigation said it became clear that NASA should not be investigating itself. The shakeup coincides with the removal of the agency's general manager by acting administrator William Graham. Members of the Presidential Commission plan to meet again Tuesday. Bill Whitaker, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
The career of those SEALs is now a prime suspect in the accident. Pictures released by NASA over the weekend clearly show an abnormal puff of smoke on the shuttle at liftoff in an area near the SEALs. Later, a plume of flame burning through the rocket, a sign of serious trouble, shortly before the spacecraft is consumed by an explosion. One Thiokol engineer who declined to be identified told CBS affiliate KSL in Salt Lake City that NASA had pressed for a launch despite objections. The investigating panel has been told that NASA talked by phone 3 times with the Thiokol engineers in Utah. The talks were reportedly sometimes heated. Thiokol finally acquiesced. Who said what when will now become crucial to the investigation. Unfortunately, no tapes or stenographic records were kept. Search teams continued to find pieces of the Challenger in the Atlantic, and submersibles may have located the suspect right-side booster rocket in 1,200 feet of water. Faced with a NASA now clearly in crisis, the White House is trying to line up a new administrator for the agency. It wants James Fletcher, who had the job once before. But that can happen only if the current administrator, James Beggs, who is on leave because of trouble unrelated to the agency, will agree to step aside. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Washington.
Decide whether the debris is in fact from the right-hand solid rocket booster. Examining what's left of that booster could well be the key to understanding why Challenger exploded. It's clear that there were several reasons to worry that there might be a booster failure. A 1983 change to a new high-performance booster rocket may have been the beginning of the problems. After years of construction, it turned out that the shuttles couldn't carry a 65,000-pound payload as NASA originally planned. So, a decision was made to shave some thickness from the booster casing, saving several thousand pounds. Power was also increased, so a thinner wall now had to withstand more pressure. The points of greatest stress in all this were the O-rings and the joints that the rings are supposed to seal. And liftoff. At liftoff, the boosters bulge outward. When that happens, the O-rings, which are much like the washers in a water faucet, could loosen and open a gap, and gases could escape. NASA engineers knew that was possible, and thick putty was packed between the two O-rings at each seam. But the original manufacturer of the putty stopped making it, and the putty used in its place was not as effective. According to Sam Bedingfield, a former top NASA engineer who's now a consultant for NBC News, all this was a recipe for big trouble.
All of these things added up to less and less margin, and in this case, we probably all added up to a worse case, which made it a catastrophic event.
It adds up like this. Black smoke at launch, a gap in the putty, perhaps causing a leak through an O-ring. Once that bulging pressure at launch was relieved, the gap closed, so there was no more smoke, but there was damage that ate away inside the booster. At 59 seconds, flame finally burned through and the external tank was ignited. NASA engineers were aware of all of these possibilities after the switch to the new boosters. There had been very few concerns before that. Changes in the new boosters were being considered, but the flaws didn't appear to be crucial to safety. Dan Molina, NBC News.
On whether the shuttle should be launched when it was, disagreeing particularly on the effect of cold weather. Here's ABC's Lynn Scher.
NASA officials were at first reluctant to discuss details about the decision to launch Challenger. But under persistent questioning by Senator Ernest Hollings, Dr. William Graham said that he had no evidence Morton Thiokol had advised against liftoff.
Is there any evidence to support that report?
No, Senator. The evidence is in the other direction.
Later, they conceded the rocket maker had concerns, but signed off.
But the final product, as I understand it, was a data fax piece of paper which had the signature on it that Thiokol supported the launch.
But ABC News has learned from a source close to the investigation that Alan McDonald, Morton Thiokol's top engineer at the launch site, objected strongly to the launch on technical grounds because of the cold temperatures. He's said to have conveyed his concern to NASA's Lawrence Malloy, but it's not clear whether Malloy relayed his concern to higher-ups in NASA. The effect of the cold weather on the booster segments is one of the areas being investigated. And ABC News has also learned that NASA technicians are currently looking into the possibility that the dark puff-up smoke visible just half a second after the rockets were ignited may indicate a problem with the putty used to seal the rocket segments. It is designed to fill the gap between the hot rocket gas and the O-ring seals. Sources say it may have had a material defect, or it may have been laid incorrectly, or it may have fallen apart in the cold. And at today's hearings, NASA acknowledged a potential problem.
That we may have had some cracking of the putty, but we don't know that for a fact.
It's already known that shortly before the launch, infrared sensors took abnormally low readings of 7 and 9 degrees from the right solid rocket booster. NASA's currently questioning the reliability of the sensors. And today, shuttle director Jess Moore said the lowest temperature allowed for launch, 31 degrees, as ABC News reported earlier, used to be 3 degrees colder. Earlier, former astronaut Neil Armstrong, vice chair of the Presidential Commission investigating the accident, refused to pinpoint what they believe caused the accident.
No, sir, we have not concluded that a specific failure was the cause.
His boss, William Rogers, elaborated for the first time on his dramatic weekend announcement that the decision-making process to launch Challenger may have been flawed.
We have not said that the decision was flawed. We said the process may have been flawed, and we based that on testimony that we've taken in executive session.
And while this was Roger's day to answer questions, some of the same ones he's been asking shuttle managers, he used his position as head of a presidential commission to resist efforts from senators that he share the facts the panel is finding immediately.
Flight safety well, on the part Senator, we are not going to make any conclusions of that kind now. We've just been in operation for 12 days, and I think it's unfair to keep asking us to draw that kind of conclusion.
Chairman Slade Gorton said the questions they were asking would have to be answered. But for the moment, the primary responsibility for finding out what happened to Challenger belongs to the Presidential Commission. Lynn Scher, ABC News, Washington.
Later in...
Engineers inside and outside NASA who insist the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster may go beyond a failure of hardware to a failure of politicized bureaucratic judgment. Allegations from people familiar with NASA's go, no-go decision-making process on the fatal launch day. People who now have told CBS News the go decision for liftoff in frigid weather was a victory for bad politics over good science and engineering sense. Eric Ingberg has been investigating.
NASA launched the Space Shuttle Challenger knowing the temperature was 10 degrees colder than many of its own engineers thought was safe. And serious charges were leveled today by engineers who worked on the shuttle, as one put it, that engineering judgments had been overridden by political decisions. One source, speaking to CBS News on condition he not be identified, said pressures on NASA to meet the shuttle's ambitious schedule were to blame for what he says was the cutting of corners. The cause of the disaster is still not known, but much evidence points to the rubber seals called O-rings between segments of the solid rockets that fire at launch. Engineers familiar with the seals told CBS News the O-rings had never been tested in a rocket at temperatures below the 47 to 50 degree range, a fact NASA managers had been told about last year. The temperature was 38 near the pad when the shuttle lifted off. Just before launch, several engineers working for the company that builds the booster expressed fears the seals would shrink and lose resiliency in cold weather, creating leaks. There were also concerns that a lubricant used to help the seals do their job would not work in the cold. Over 8.5 hours, there were a series of telephone debates among engineers in Utah and Alabama before those concerns were overridden. The President's Commission investigating the accident has still not determined whether those seals failed. Its chairman, William Rogers, and vice chairman, former astronaut Neil Armstrong, appeared before a Senate committee today, expressing optimism the cause could be determined quickly.
If we determine what happened quickly, and we're speaking about visually, we can isolate it to an area and be sure that's the case, then I think we can. Certainly, I hope we can. That's what we're going to try to do.
We learn all about the weather, the O-rings, the tensile strength of the solid rocket booster, and at this particular junction, it seems like an unavoidable accident rather than an unavoidable one.
CBS News has been told that 15 engineers from the Morton Thiokol Company, which makes the solid rocket booster, opposed the decision to launch. One said they thought they had won the argument until late the evening before the launch when their battle was lost. Said one engineer, "I was there and I couldn't stop it." Eric Engberg, CBS News, Washington.
Included in the testimony of top NASA officials given Congress today, testimony that the actual launch decision makers at NASA were never told that temperatures on the right solid rocket booster had fallen in some spots to just 7 and 9 degrees above zero just a few hours before the launch, while it isn't known whether...
We'll look and find out. I'm not going to speculate at the moment.
But you're convinced that that was a political decision, not a scientific one?
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, scientifically, the head of the project said, for those particular motors, no siree, and I would even sign off on it. And so they got the pressure from NASA to go over his head back to Utah that didn't know from Sikkim what was going on.
Senator Holling says the Presidential Commission investigating the shuttle explosion is doing it wrong by conducting part of its inquiry in secret. Holling says it must be done in public to restore confidence in NASA. For In Day News, Jeff Kamen in Washington.
Meanwhile, a new Soviet spacecraft...
Site, first of all, wanted to believe what they had actually seen had happened.
All that was left was the gift the artists brought to Canaveral, a magnum of Dom Perignon engraved for the Challenger 7 crew.
The artists hoped to have the 7 autograph the bottle and then pop it open when the crew returned from space. Amazingly, Ron McNair's wife had each astronaut engrave it the night before the launch. The 7 signatures almost seem to jump off the surface of the bottle. Krista McAuliffe's autograph has the deliberate, neat script of a school teacher. Dick Scobie obviously had to get the hang of writing with that diamond pen. Now, this priceless memento, made in happy tribute, will go to the Smithsonian as one of the last personalized remembrances of the Challenger 7 crew. A bottle that carries its own peculiar kind of story.
I think that anybody's signature has part of their personal vibration on it when you sign your name to anything. And it was kind of eerie to be looking at this and knowing that these brave individuals weren't with us any longer.
Well, thank you so much for having.
In the shuttle investigation was brought to the surface off the coast of Florida this weekend. And as Bruce Hall reports from the Kennedy Space Center, a number of key issues are also expected to surface this week at hearings in Washington.
The Presidential Commission's public meetings this week will concentrate on the controversial decision to launch Challenger following a night of sub-freezing temperatures. There are new reports that infrared sensor readings of 7 and 9 degrees on the right solid rocket booster were relayed over a NASA communications network that is normally monitored by technicians and launch officials. Top shuttle managers have said they were not aware of the extremely cold temperature readings and would not have approved the launch if they had known about it. Also testifying before the Presidential Commission will be several Morton Thiokol engineers who opposed launching in the cold weather. In the search for debris, a Navy robot submersible has apparently located and photographed a portion of one of the shuttle's 3 main engines. 2 fishing vessels also brought in debris today, small pieces that were picked up by their nets. However, the most important find may have been a 15-foot piece of metal that is believed to be a part of the external tank, a key item in the investigation of the shuttle explosion. The metal panel was put aboard a truck and brought to the Space Center so investigators can make a positive identification. Bruce Hall, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
Some thought devastating. The Presidential Commission investigating the Challenger disaster heard how engineers from the company that makes the shuttle's boosters, Morton Thiokol, argued with their superiors and NASA officials that a launch could be unsafe, only to be overruled. Lynn Scher has the story.
The working engineers at Morton Thiokol publicly pointed their fingers at their own management and at NASA today, telling the Presidential Commission that based on data they saw from their headquarters in Utah, they were unanimous in not wanting Challenger to fly January 28th.
There was not one positive statement for launch ever made in that room.
Roger Beaujolais was so distressed by erosion of the O-ring seals he examined from the previous cold weather launch, he wrote a report last July warning of the danger.
The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life.
I wrote a memo to my management, project engineering, indicated that we should stop flying.
Alan McDonald, a manager, said he was so upset about the cold weather that when other Thiokol managers reversed the decision, he refused to sign the approval to launch.
In fact, I made the direct statement that if anything happened to this launch, told him I sure wouldn't want to be the person that had to stand in front of a board of inquiry.
The engineers told of a telephone conference between Utah, Cape Canaveral, and the Marshall Space Flight Center the night before launch. They told of expressing their opposition to the launch and of NASA's reaction. From one manager, George Hardy, that he was appalled at the recommendation. From another, Lawrence Malloy, about when we'll ever get this launch off. Then a Thiokol manager in Utah held a caucus and took a vote without the working engineers.
We only polled the management people because we had already established that we were not going to be unanimous.
The commissioners appeared as dumbfounded today as they were when they first heard the story in secret session 10 days ago.
What was driving here? What was to be achieved that caused you to go?
I think we've heard what the explanation you've given. I think the problem we're having, it's not convincing.
There are still questions. Why did Thiokol managers reverse their decision with no new data? And why did NASA managers fail to relay the controversy to top NASA officials? That testimony tomorrow. Lynn Scher, ABC News, Washington.
We feel that that's a leak. May or may not be related to temperature.
That indicates a possible failure of both rubber O-rings at the seam of the rocket, allowing the hot gas from the propellant to escape. The commissioners were clearly startled by the new close-ups.
Those are better pictures than these.
The commission seemed equally taken aback at further evidence of flawed decision-making, this time regarding ice on the pad, the worst ever, icicles up to a foot long that could damage Challenger's tiles on liftoff. After seeing these scenes on television from his headquarters in California, the manager of the company that built the shuttle called his people in Florida and said,
So we cannot recommend launching from here. So let's make sure that the NASA understand that Rockwell feel it's not safe to launch.
But Petrone's subordinate relayed the message slightly differently.
I stated more than once during the meeting Rockwell's position that we could not assure that it was safe to fly.
Concern was voiced, and it was not an objection to launch. And I think the people that were in that meeting from Rockwell intended to offer me that concern, but they did not intend to ask me not to launch.
If the decision-making process is such that the prime contractor thinks he objected, and you say that was not our understanding, that shows a serious deficiency in the process.
Rogers concluded with this strong condemnation of the system that launched Challenger on the day it exploded.
You'll remember that I did say at one point that we thought the decision-making process may be flawed. I believe I'm speaking for the whole commission when I say that we think it is flawed.
Former Shuttle Chief Jess Moore acknowledged they're fixing the system, but the commission's judgment is a major blow to NASA. It's also a major step forward in the accident investigation. One commissioner told us, "We had no idea we'd make so much progress this fast." Lynn Scher, ABC News, Washington.
Of shuttle flights that experienced problems with rocket seals. Robert Shackney has more on the continuing shuttle investigation.
The dramatic public part of the Presidential Commission investigation, what one commission member calls the NASA bashing phase, is over for now. For the week ahead, the commission is dividing itself into 4 subcommittees to look into technical questions. The commission has already passed harsh judgment on NASA's decision to launch the Challenger in the cold. Commission Chairman William Rogers called it flawed.
The trouble with so much paperwork, you eliminate the element of good judgment and common sense.
This dramatic photo shows disaster happening at the moment of launch. The puff of black smoke at the critical booster rocket joint. Almost certainly a sign the rubber seal is burning and in the process of failing. It would fail completely 60 seconds later. Still uncertain is why. Cold is a prime suspect, but not the only one. Other possibilities, design flaws, design changes like reducing the thickness of the rocket casing, errors in assembly, heavier payloads, unexpected vibrations. The list is long. In the week ahead, the 24 astronauts involved in the investigation are likely to be more outspoken. 2 of them, Bob Crippen and Bob Overmeyer, attended closed meetings of the Presidential Commission, are known to have been as upset as commission members were with what they learned. Robert Shackney, CBS News, Washington.
There was a breakdown somewhere that word didn't get to us, that we've been having these minor problems with the seals and that they've been going on for some time. In fact, my last 2 flights had a problem with seals and I didn't know it. But
that strikes me as possibly an oversight. That's however it didn't get to us, well, I think that's something we should have been aware of.
The astronauts also felt, and they became aware of the NASA's being hurt by its own public relations, mainly because they feel the shuttle missions were just routine as far as that's what the public were feeling. Well, at the White House...
America's first woman in space, Dr. Sally Ride, talked to ABC's Lynn Scher.
She has been one of the most active members of the Presidential Commission. But today, Sally Ride spoke out for the first time on her personal reaction to the accident that has halted space flight.
I am not ready to fly again now. I think that there are very few astronauts who are ready to fly again now. I think we all believe that it's important for NASA to, number one, understand the problem and dedicate themselves to fixing the problem, and also to just assess other areas of the program and areas within NASA to make sure that there aren't other accidents lurking in the background.
Dr. Ride, a 34-year-old physicist, flew on 2 shuttle flights, both on Challenger.
I pictured the feeling of excitement that I'd had during that launch, and then picturing the accident and focusing back on the accident. When I realized how fast it happened, I guess it sort of hit home to me that during a launch, that's not what you're thinking about.
She said she dealt with the potential danger of space travel a year or so before she first went up, by weighing the risks and making her decision. By contrast, she said private citizens who have flown on the shuttle, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe, may not have had the same opportunity to understand the risks.
I think that we may have been misleading people into thinking that this is a routine operation, that it's just like getting on an airliner and going across the country, and that it's that safe. And it's not. Now, maybe they did understand the risks. Maybe they didn't. And I think that that's NASA's responsibility, and I'm not sure that NASA had carried out that responsibility.
And she said she considered the shuttle operational only in the sense that it could carry out experiments and deliver payloads into orbit.
If you mean, did I believe that we could launch every 3 weeks, that was really stretching the system, I think. Just from the point of view of putting a lot of stress on a lot of very competent engineers and possibly spreading the people and the resources a little bit too thin.
Dr. Ride wouldn't discuss the investigation itself, but she admitted that last week's revelations about the flawed decision-making process and the lack of rocket testing affected her.
I was disturbed, I think is a good way to put it.
But she warns that they may never find out exactly what caused Challenger to explode.
We don't know what happened yet. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what happened if you can identify the 5 or 10 or 2 weak links in the system.
Even if they are fixed, she says the shuttle could still be grounded for another few years. One possibility of failure has been ice in the rocket joint, and that theory may have gotten new support. Aviation Week magazine's next issue says a puff of steam emerged from the joint at ignition. That may be one of at least 9 scenarios to be discussed here at public hearings tomorrow. Lynn Scher, ABC News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
There has been a